Go Long by Hazel Witch. Read by Kaiinbed. Chapter 7. The Last Quarter. The next morning was torture. Izuku woke to a crack of light streaming through the window, birds chirping outside as if everything was normal, as if the world hadn't changed beyond all recognition the night. There was a pounding in his head that throbbed from one temple to the other, tendrils of dread squeezing hard and cruel at his heart, coiling up his throat and wrapping around his neck like a noose, tightening, choking. The raging hangover set his gut in a churn, and he felt so nauseous. But it was the gaping hole in his chest, deep and dark and agonizing, that had him jolting from bed and stumbling to the bathroom. Oh God, oh God, oh God. The hallway flashed in a blur as he passed, slamming the bathroom door and bolting it shut, sinking to his knees and heaving up the contents of his stomach again and again. Acid coated his throat, stinging, a bitter taste in his mouth, up his nose, sweat dampening his brow when he finally collapsed back against the bathtub. He felt empty. So empty. Like he was falling, drowning, sinking, all alone. Above him, the light bulb flickered, a low, steady buzz coming from somewhere in the fixture, and Izuku blinked back at it blearily. Disgusting. Katsuki's voice echoed around his brain, buffeting at his skull as if it could seek out a crack and slip out into the air to mock him for real. Stomach lurching at the memory, he swallowed the lump of desolation in his throat, clamping his lips and forcing it down, only for it to swirl and slosh and writhe around in his insides. To make things worse, his lungs were disobedient when he tried to suck down a breath, two useless organs that refused to fill with air. Shallow breaths devolved into wheezing gasps, short, quick inhalations, followed by panic, his chest fluttering up and down like an injured animal. He gripped the side of the bathtub with strained knuckles. Izuku, are you okay, honey? Shit, he couldn't face his mom like this. He tried to calm down, tried to slow his breathing so he could tell her he was fine. Tried to control the stifled pants slipping from his mouth, but it was no use. The sharp, wet sobs came thick and fast, and all he could do was curl his arms around his knees and will himself to cry more quietly. The soft tapping on the door grew into louder, desperate knocking. Izuku, let me in! The doorknob rattled, followed by several heavy thumps through the wood. You gotta let me in, baby. He didn't want to. Didn't want her to see him like this. Didn't want to have to explain. But there was a tiny voice in his head that told him he couldn't do this alone. And so Izuku crawled, hauling himself across the stretch of linoleum, hand gripping at his chest as he drew back the latch. The door burst open and his mom was there, dropping down next to him and pulling him into her. What happened? She asked, voice full of worry, clutching him tight in her arms. Oh God, Izuku, you need to breathe, okay? Breathe with me, honey. Come on. In and out. She inhaled a slow, intentional breath, holding onto him tight. I'm fine, he choked out, patting at her back as if that would make her believe him. Please, Mom, I'm sorry. I don't want you to worry about me. Shh. It's okay. Just breathe. Another wave of uncontrollable sobs racked from Izuku's chest at the look of concern on her face, but he couldn't hold them back anymore. He let the floodgates burst open entirely, let everything pour out. Shh, his mom whispered again, stroking his hair and rocking him back and forth like a baby. Shh, it's okay. Izuku buried his head into her shoulder, allowing himself to be held, trying to follow her lead as she continued her slow, steady breaths. At first, he shook from head to toe with every attempt, still unable to carry out the most basic of bodily functions. But eventually, her soft, soothing voice did the trick, and his chest finally settled back into some kind of stilted rhythm. They were both damp with tears, entangled together on the bathroom floor by the time he fully calmed down. Izuku, his mom said softly into the silence. What happened, sweetie? He stilled against her, sniffling through his nose. What the hell was he supposed to say? You can tell me, honey. I won't be mad. Nose buried into her soft knit cardigan, he shook his head slightly. Did someone hurt you? At the party? Izuku shook his head harder and regretted it when blood thundered through his ears and he felt like he might puke again. Technically, someone had hurt him, but he didn't know how to explain to his mom that it hadn't been in the physical sense. Are you sad about a girl? No, he replied thickly. At least he could tell the truth about that. His mom remained quiet for a minute, smoothing a hand up and down his back in soothing motions. Her next words were gentle, careful. Are you sad about a boy? Izuku's chest hitched in an involuntary hiccup, eyes squeezing shut. It was an answer of sorts. He didn't have to say a thing. His mom only clutched him tighter. Oh, Izuku. I'm sorry, honey. There. She knew. His mom knew his worst-kept secret. Katsuki fucking hated him, and everything in Izuku's average little world had been tipped on its head. Come on, sweetie. Mom produced a tissue from her sleeve and dabbed at Izuku's sore face. Let's get you cleaned up. Later, swaddled in a blanket on the couch, a mug of ginger tea warming his fingers, the piercing hurt that shrieked through Izuku's body when he first woken up had dulled to a throbbing ache. The wound was still there, open and ugly, but his mom had patched him up with a makeshift bandage of love and kindness that stemmed the worst of the bleeding. Do you want to talk about it? She asked, from beside him, shifting the everyday clutter on the coffee table to make space for her mug. Izuku leaned forward to help. I don't know, he said when he sat back. Which part? Any of it. All of it, or none of it. Whatever you feel might help. Biting his lip, Izuku considered. He didn't want to talk about anything, only wanted to sink back into the couch cushions until they enveloped him completely, like a lost quarter that would only be rediscovered several years later. But he knew he couldn't just disappear. Life didn't work like that. I guess I've always known, he whispered, and his mom nodded intently, fixing him with green eyes that matched his own. I guess I've always felt different. He realized his hands were shaking when he went to take another sip of tea. They'd never had this conversation. It just hadn't felt necessary, all too personal and difficult and complicated to share. But the honey in the tea eased some of the bitter taste in his mouth and reminded him that he was safe here. His mom put a gentle arm around his shoulders. You know I love you no matter what, don't you? She sounded so firm, the statement so adamant and yet filled with care that it made fresh tears spring to his eyes. You're so special, Izuku. You are kind and smart and determined, and you deserve the world, honey. The world. I know it might not feel that way right now, but you deserve all the love and joy life has to offer, and I truly believe it's out there waiting for you. There were tears in Mom's eyes too. They'd always been an emotional pair. I love you so much, she added, brushing a soft thumb against his cheek to wipe the tracks of moisture away. You have the biggest heart of anyone I know. Izuku felt his lip wobble and voice crack when he spoke. I got it from you. Oh, Izuku. Gently taking the mug from his hands and setting it aside, she drew him into a hug and squeezed him tight as the two of them cried and clutched at one another. Two sensitive souls holding on through the storm. It'll all be okay, she murmured into his shoulder, and Izuku tried his best to believe her. The weeks that followed dragged by, like Izuku was wading through thigh-deep water. He carried the night of the party around in the pit of his stomach, an anchor weighing him down that never seemed to lift. It was always there, and it was always heavy. His mom did her best to help, watching him closely, offering sweet smiles and suggesting cozy movie nights. Now the evenings were dark and long. It'll get better, she always said, whenever he picked at his dinner. Give it a few weeks, honey, and it'll pass. So he waited, and time passed, and still he felt awful. Throwing himself into studying was the only coping mechanism he knew, and he ramped up the focus on schoolwork with everything he had. If he'd been burning the midnight oil before, now he was burning something even more potent. But there was no way in hell he'd let his mind be still for more than a second. Not if that left him vulnerable to painful things like thinking, or worse, feeling. So he moved his desk to face the wall. He kept his curtains closed and his lamp perpetually on. He shoved his nose in a book and hovered on the porch each morning until he was sure Katsuki's black Jeep had pulled out of the driveway. "Come sit with us," Ochako begged every lunch break. "He's not even in the cafeteria most days. You probably won't even see him." But Izuku couldn't face the heartbreak that lay in wait for him in Katsuki's glare. Couldn't face the way it would strip him back until there was nothing left of him but ash and a few singed wisps of curly hair. He sat in the library and he studied instead, his little circle of friends taking it in turns to keep him company. What they got out of it, Izuku couldn't say. His level of moping made him no fun at all to be around. But whether it made sense or not, he was grateful to have them there. Grateful they seemed to have agreed upon some kind of schedule that meant he was never alone. College applications came and went, and Izuku only wished he could feel more excitement when he sent them off into the ether for judgment. As it was, all he seemed to feel was a pervading sense of numbness. Although, that was better than crippling melancholy, he supposed. And anyway, what mattered was that the countdown to the rest of his life had begun. His real life. Not this blip of an existence that flitted from one disaster to the next. All he had to do was get through the rest of the school year, and then he'd be able to slam the lid on this town shut. He'd be able to forget. He'd be able to move on. What was one more day of living in grayscale, when the promise of sunshine was just beyond his reach? December brought with it a cold snap that made Izuku's breath come out in fleeting clouds of white against the frigid air. Looking on as UA took the field for the final game of the state championship playoffs. Coach Inui had fought hard to host the showdown on home turf, a fact Izuku was grateful for, as it meant he'd be able to hurry straight home afterward, instead of having to share a bus ride with a bunch of overexcited jocks. A blessing when he was sure that one amongst them would rather be subjected to 12 hours of waterboarding than one in his presence. "Let's just get this over with," Ochako said beside him, curling warm fingers around his icy hand. He tried his best to smile. "Yeah." Whoops and hollers echoed around the stands, excited chatter rumbling like thunder across a crowd at maximum capacity. "There's a scout here tonight!" Izuku heard one of the parents shout to another from a few rows back. "Come to see that Bakugo boy!" Izuku's heart faltered at the mention of Katsuki's name and all the expectation that went along with it. But he just squeezed Ochako's hand and looked straight ahead. Tonight was the final game. The final 4 quarters before he could put this all behind him. Everyone was on track to go as planned. He would watch from afar as Katsuki achieved all his hopes and dreams, and then he would pretend they never met in the first place. That's just how it had to be. Except when the starting whistle blew, it was clear from the outset that things weren't going as planned. Even Izuku, with his rudimentary understanding of the rulebook, could tell something was horribly wrong. The team was not cohesive, their acclaimed quarterback in terrible form. Katsuki lost the ball several times, hands fumbling, throws lacking in power and missing their target. And without their brightest star to guide them, UA quickly fell apart. It was painful to watch. The excited chanting of the crowd in the homestands died down to an anxious hum as the other team scored a touchdown, then a field goal. UA didn't even put up a good fight, their performance severely, pitifully lackluster, and with every lost point, Katsuki grew visibly more agitated. By the end of the agonizing game, the score stood at 41-3 in favor of the opposition. They had lost badly. After a historically spectacular season, UA had lost out on their shot at the championship with a game the local newspaper later called a gut-wrenching blow for the town. Izuku watched as Katsuki wrenched his helmet from his head and chucked it to the ground, giving it an angry kick and striding from the field. His shoulders were so tense, they practically pressed against his earlobes, fingers squeezing into fists at his sides. Even though he was too far to get a good look at his face, it was obvious he was raging. Kirishima chased him down, laying a conciliatory arm across Katsuki's shoulder and speaking close to his ear. But Katsuki shrugged him off with more force than necessary and stormed towards the locker room. Izuku couldn't stand it. All the emotions of the preceding weeks, everything he'd fought so hard to stamp down, was suddenly set loose by seeing Katsuki hurting. He couldn't just sit by and watch. I've gotta go, he said over his shoulder, already beginning to push his way down the narrow row, stepping over discarded cartons of fries. Ignoring the grumbles of those he passed, he made it to the stairs and thundered to the bottom, faster than he'd ever known his legs to move. He had to check that Katsuki was okay, regardless of how things were between them, regardless of whether there was anything between them or not. This would be a blow, a possible dent to Katsuki's sky-high ambitions, a singular gray cloud across the expanse of endless blue that had been his track record on the sport thus far. Izuku understood that when it came to being scouted, all it took was one errant rain cloud for you to find yourself drenched and out of the running. He'd learned that from Katsuki himself. Weaving between throngs of disappointed spectators as they headed to their vehicles, he made for the locker rooms, only pausing when he reached the entrance. He dithered outside, taking a few strides forward when he mustered up the courage, then chickening out and circling back with his hands behind his head. What exactly was he doing? What exactly was he going to say to Katsuki if he got the chance? He'd been avoiding the guy for weeks, and it wasn't like Katsuki would actually want to see him anyway. It was probably best Izuku hold back. Best to let Katsuki's friends deal with it. They were the ones that could offer him comfort. Internally talking himself in circles for over half an hour, Izuku counted each player as they passed. The shared expression of the UA team was one of bitter disappointment, each of them downtrodden and harrowed in their own way. Even Kirishima's expression was grim when he finally pushed through the doors, bag slung over his shoulder, and red hair slicked to his face. He managed to give Izuku the smallest of smiles, but it slipped quickly away into tiredness and resignation. "He's still in there," he said, answering Izuku's question before he had the chance to open his mouth. He's not in a good way, man. He's been in a shitty mood for weeks, but this is something else. It's probably best everyone just leaves him alone for a while." Izuku swallowed, frog in his throat, desperate to make a leap for freedom. "Is he by himself?" Rubbing a hand back and forth across his forehead, Kirishima nodded and let his bag slump to the floor. "We all tried to talk to him, tried to get him to calm down, but none of us could get through to him. He's really upset, Izuku. I know he'd never say that, and it seems like he's gone crazy in there, but..." Izuku placed a shaky hand on Eijiro's shoulder when his usually cheery voice cracked. "I know, I get it." It was disconcerting to see him so crushed. Izuku's heart broke for all of them. "You did everything you could," he said firmly. Eijiro sighed, stooping to pick up his bag. "I guess," he relented, forcing a half-smile that was nothing like his usual shark-like grin. "I'm gonna head home. Looks like everyone else has." Izuku gave him a nod, and tried to make it clear in his expression that he knew Kirishima had done his best, both on the field and off it. He watched as the captain of UA's defeated football team walked away, taking a deep breath and making up his mind. It was time to be brave. The locker room was strewn with debris, various discarded items of clothing, helmets, and water bottles all over the place. It looked like a bomb of blue and white paint had exploded and coated every surface with UA school colors. Izuku had a feeling the items scattered around the room had not been placed there by their owners. Had the strong impression that most of them had been kicked, thrown, and upended in a whirlwind of fury by the boy that now sat on the bench with his head in his hands. He hadn't even changed out of his uniform yet. Izuku approached with caution, stepped so quiet he went undetected until he spoke. Hello? Katsuki's face whipped towards him, twisting into a glower that made Izuku's heart sink right down to his feet. The fuck do you want? It was the expected response, and yet it still made Izuku's lip quiver until he bit down on it. I wanted to see if you're okay. Snorting a laugh like Izuku had made the funniest joke on earth, Katsuki pushed himself up and rounded on him. Oh yeah, I'm fucking fantastic right now, Deku. Can't you tell? He spun on the spot with arms outstretched, gesturing to the mess that surrounded him. Just my entire damn future down the drain. No big deal. I'm hunky fucking dory. If anger was the norm for Katsuki Bakugo, then this was something else. Something that swelled and roared, barely contained beneath the surface. It doesn't mean your future's ruined, Izuku mumbled, looking down. Eijiro was probably right. He should have left Katsuki alone. What did Izuku think he could possibly say or do that his teammates hadn't already tried? The scout, I saw him. He looked impressed. Liar! Katsuki spat, practically hissing the words like a viper. Why should I believe anything out of your mouth when all of this is your fault in the first place? Izuku took a step back, wounded and confused. What? He croaked, blood pounding in his ears, fingers fidgeting with the buttons of his band uniform. What's it gotta do with me? Katsuki clicked his teeth together, his face scrunched up tight, shoulders hunched. He didn't cut his usual cocky, intimidating figure when he was like this, standing alone in the middle of the room. He looked smaller, sadder, like he was on the cusp of tears. Don't act dumb, Deku, he said eventually. Izuku took a step forward, wanting nothing more than to go to him, to pull Katsuki into a hug and stroke his beautiful face, and try to comfort him to the best of his ability. But instead, he paused, leaving several feet of distance between them. I know you think I'm disgusting, he whispered, unable to hide the hurt in his voice. I know maybe you thought we were friends, or I don't know, maybe not friends, but acquaintances or something. And now you hate me because of what you saw, because you know that I'm gay. But I don't see what that's got to do with your game. He felt the tears well up in his eyes, didn't even try to stop them as they spilled over and trickled down his cheeks. Little plump droplets of misery pulling at his jaw. The accumulation of all the previous weeks overflowing in front of the person he wanted to hide it from most. Katsuki's head snapped to him, eyes wide and staring. What? He said flatly, voice low. I'm sorry, I never should have come here. I don't know what I was thinking. Tears flowed freely, Izuku's breath hitching every time he tried to take a lungful of air. He hated how embarrassing it was, breaking down like an idiot. I just wanted to make sure you were okay, because I know how much this all means to you, but I was being stupid. God, I'm sorry. Lifting a fist to swipe at his eyes, Izuku turned and stumbled out the door. He didn't know where he was going, just knew he had to get away. Had to put some space between them so his brain could stop short-circuiting for 2 minutes and allow him to think. His bike was behind the bleachers, but he couldn't ride home yet. Not like this. He needed to calm down first, to clear his mind. So instead, he carried on straight ahead, half running, half blundering out onto the deserted football field. There was a loud bang of doors behind him. Deku, wait! Izuku didn't turn, just kept on going. Another wave of teardrops dampening the collar of his uniform as they slid down his neck. Heavy footsteps thundered at his back, faster than he could ever outrun. Fingers gripped his bicep and spun him so quickly he almost fell. But Katsuki's hands steadied him on either side, holding him upright. Fuck, Deku. Can't you wait a damn minute before you just run off like that? Amber eyes bored into Izuku's wide and wild, the reflection of the floodlights sparkling across black pupils. That isn't what I meant, Katsuki said, voice firm and low, the same register he used when sharing hush tactics with the team. When I said that at the party, I never meant that you were disgusting. Izuku fought to control the sob that rose from his throat, but it shuddered out before he could stop it. You don't have to pretend. What else can you have meant? He said between gasps. You saw me with him and... Yeah. Katsuki's grip on Izuku's arm tightened. With him. What do you... Taking a step back, Katsuki wrenched his eyes away and combed the hand aggressively through his hair. It's not you who's disgusting, he said after a pause, punctuated by each of their irregular breaths. It's him. He's always trying to fucking antagonize me. Always wants whatever I have. Wants what's mine. He looked off across the field. Grass pockmarked with footprints and tracked over with mud. So now he wants you. For at least a few moments, time stood still, and the earth paused on its axis. Even the songbirds and the wind rustling through the leaves fell silent, to Izuku's ears at least. What? There was no way Katsuki meant what he was saying. Not in the way Izuku had just heard. There was some miscommunication, a different way of reading between the lines Izuku was failing to understand. For fuck's sake, don't make me say it again. No, he couldn't possibly. But Kami, she's your girlfriend or something. She's not my fucking girlfriend. Jesus Christ. I saw how you were with her. You don't let anyone close like that. I saw you leave with her. Katsuki turned back to meet Izuku's gaze, eyes blazing bright with an emotion he couldn't read. There was an uncertainty to his features that felt alien, an expression of confusion that tore at Izuku's chest. Hands still gripping at his hair, Katsuki slipped his tongue over his lip before responding. No, I don't like her like that, okay? But I'm not a fucking idiot. I know that I should. Izuku remained silent, heart hammering so hard against his ribs, it felt like they could shatter at any moment. I see how other guys look at her. I know that if I was fucking normal, I would too. He went on, voice coarse and rough as if he'd been screaming for hours. So I was trying, okay? Made me fucking sick, but I thought I could do it. Izuku's eyes widened. Had they? Nothing happened, Katsuki said quickly. I told her I wasn't interested. And then I was trying to find you. But then I went outside and caught you with that creep. He spat the final word out like it pained him. And somewhere beneath all the rage, Izuku thought he could make out something sad and lost in the golden boy's face. I made a mistake, Izuku whispered, shame flooding right through him all the way to his fingertips. But I saw you with Kami, and I just couldn't take it. And Shindo said, Katsuki mimicked, cheeks heating from rosy pink to a deep red hue. That piece of shit would say anything to get in your pants. Izuku, are you really that fucking dim? Pinching the bridge of his nose, he swore under his breath. Fuck, sorry, look. He dragged his hand from his face and reached out to grasp at Izuku's arms again, looking him square in the face. I don't like girls. Izuku felt his eyebrows shoot up before he could stop them. I don't like dudes either, Katsuki added in a hurry, and Izuku's heart sank back down from where it had floated into his throat. I don't like people. Not in that way. Anyone. I just ain't built like that. Izuku didn't know what to say, but he knew it was important that Katsuki was opening up to him, splaying open the gory details of himself for Izuku to observe like a display case holding something precious. He knew he had to say something, had to acknowledge what Katsuki said, and not let on that the words split his heart right down the middle. Okay, Izuku murmured, trying not to let any sorrow escape into his voice. That's okay. I just like you. Time stopped for a second time. Before Izuku could respond, before he could even process the words that hung between them. Fresh and new and fragile as spun glass, Katsuki stepped forward and moved a hand to his cheek, palm warm and large. His face was still tense, jaw still clenched tight, but his eyes were soft, and his eyelashes glinted like threads of gold. You what? Shut up, Katsuki said, this time without any heat. Moving so close, his breath tickled Izuku's nose. Just shut the hell up for once. Then he was closing his eyes, and his face was tilting to the side, and oh, a world of color lit up behind Izuku's eyes as their lips brushed together. Soft and sweet and everything he'd ever dreamed of. The kiss rolled him up and lifted him off the ground. A spark that set alight and burst into shimmering fireworks in his chest. Trembling hands found Katsuki's shoulders and held on tight in case the ground slipped away beneath his sneakers. He felt practically effervescent, light enough that a gust of wind could blow him away. But he needed to stay earthbound for this. Needed to stay right here. A hand slipped from his arm to snake around his waist, pulling him closer so their heat was shared at all the places their bodies pressed together. Izuku leaned into it, let himself get lost in the sensation of touch and wonder. Katsuki's lips parted and he tasted the peppermint, his tongue slow and languid when it met Izuku's own. It was a little slice of heaven on a cold winter's night. Only the empty stands looking on as they turned the sports field into their own personal paradise. So this was how it was supposed to be. When they drew apart, it was all too soon. Katsuki's arms still holding Izuku tight to his chest. They stared at each other for a moment, eyes glazed before Katsuki pulled back enough for Izuku to come down from his tiptoes. You get the message yet? He said in his raspy drawl, and Izuku slid his hands to Katsuki's chest, looking up in disbelief. He mumbled, a slow smile spreading across his lips. I think I might need to hear it one more time before it sinks in. Katsuki rolled his eyes, but didn't try to hide his crooked grin. Dumbass. Shaking off all the disappointment of the evening, he pulled Izuku in for another kiss. And even if only for that moment, everything finally felt right in the world.